Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Greedy corporate mega stores, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a law in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, tell your lawmakers, hands off my rewards. Tell them to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Broback.
And this week we are tackling one of Christie's short stories, another Poirot from her first collection. This is the $1 Million Bond Robbery, first published in the Sketch magazine, May 2nd, 1923. So let's get right into this. Our victim is a little unorthodox in that
there's not really a victim.
There's not really a victim because this is actually one of the few Christie stories that is not a murder mystery. There is no murder here. The victim is the London and Scottish Bank, I guess we could say. The bank has been fleeced of $1 million in Liberty Bond, and presumably any American parties who were interested in having business dealings with this bank to the tune of those $1 million will also be victimized by this crime. To a certain extent, there is one man more than any other who is also victimized. That is Philip Ridgway, who is a promising young banker, and his career is going off the rails a bit because everyone thinks that he is the one who somehow stole the bonds, or was at least responsible for the bonds being stolen. And with that in mind, let's get to the suspects.
So suspect number one is Philip Ridgway, who, I mean, he was the guy in charge of the bonds. Yeah. So, I mean, clearly the person carrying the bonds that have gone missing is probably a little bit suspect. He was given them in a special portmanteau with special locks to basically ferry across the Atlantic on a luxury liner, the Olympia. It's a very special case. Everybody had specialized keys, and yet somehow, whoops, just went missing from his cabin. They're missing when he gets to New York. So now he's panicking back in London, and it's his charming, lovely, worried fiancée, Esme, who is in fact the one who involves Poirot and Hastings in hoping to figure out the solution to where the bonds disappeared.
Yes, the wonderfully named Esme Farquhar, which, as you pointed out, Catherine, is a very manic pixie dream girl-esque name. Like Zach Braff, definitely. I think there could have been a character named Esme Farquhar in Garden State.
Yeah, who just like wants to desperately protect her slightly graying yet barely 30 fiance. He sounds quite dashing, really.
Well, again, and I feel like I harp on Agatha Christie's personal predilections for men a lot, but for whatever reason, they just really stand out to me because they're so consistent. And the only thing that Christie loves more than a graying temple is, of course, a sunburned face. Yes, a tan/sunburned face. But those two characteristics, like, she is really, really into the tan faces and the graying temples. That does it for her, you know?
I mean, I could see it. You know, like a little bit of maturity.
I get it.
So, like, he's like hale but mature. Philip is also the nephew of one of the men in charge of the London and Scottish Bank, Mr. Vavasseur, who is described as being very grave and gray and white-bearded, and really lacking in general personality, other than the fact that he is in charge of the bank, and that also he is one of 3 people in possession of a key to the portmanteau in which the bonds are being ferried across the Atlantic.
Right. So the third person who's in possession of the key is Mr. Shaw, who is also grave and gray, although not bearded, and he is the colleague of Mr. Vavasseur, the other person who runs this bank. Mr. Shaw is actually the one that ordered the special lock and key that was put on the portmanteau. And then the only thing that really distinguishes him other than that is that he claims to be suffering from a severe case of bronchitis, which has kept him out of the ever so thrilling world of banking for the 2 weeks that it takes the portmanteau to go on this ship, go missing, and then for all of these people to come back to London. So when they get back is when he seems to have finally made his recovery.
The only other possible suspect is one Mr. Ventnor, who is a passenger aboard the Olympia, and he is incredibly elderly and an invalid who is stuck in his cabin the entire time. He's in fact such an invalid, he was last off the boat, and he also happens to be staying, very much adjacent to Mr. Ridgway's room.
So let's take a snapshot of the world as it seems to be before Monsieur Poirot tells us what the answer to this mystery is. It seems like Philip Ridgway really screwed up somehow, or that he masterminded the theft of these bonds, which is why he's in such a bad position and his fiancée Esme is so worried about him. The bonds were in this special compartment in the portmanteau. They were locked away. As far as we know, Mr. Ridgway was the only person on the boat in possession of a key. And before the ship docks in New York, Ridgway comes upon the portmanteau with the locks scratched and the bonds missing, which is very curious because even though the locks have been all scratched up, it's also clear that someone actually did insert the key and unlock it. That's sort of confusing. And then the ship is searched, no bonds are found. But almost immediately, right after the ship docks, the bonds actually appear on the market, which means that whoever stole them is selling them right as the ship has docked. And in fact, there's even one report of the bonds being sold just before the ship docked, which is very curious since, that would seem to indicate that maybe the bonds were thrown overboard and tugged into port earlier, but the only official tugboat associated with the ship, it has stayed near the ship, so that's impossible. The bonds cannot be sent wirelessly. So this is really a very puzzling conundrum, and Mr. Ridgway is in big trouble.
Here's a life lesson, I think. If you are responsible for a very expensive package that is being put in your luggage and locked, it might be a really good idea to really, really make sure what's in that package before locking it up and taking responsibility for it. Important thing to know in life, I think. It's like how you're never supposed to leave your bags unattended at the airport in case somebody puts a mysterious package in them. This is a little bit like this, except he's aware that there is a wrapped package in his luggage. That said, we could talk about some of the clues. Sort of the first significant clue, which is repeated throughout the story, is the date that the Olympia departs, which is on the 23rd. It's also the date that the package is put into the luggage. Mr. Ridgway departs for America, and that's also when Mr. Shaw is taken ill with bronchitis. So the deduction here for a reader is that whenever a date or time is repeatedly mentioned in a Christie case, you should probably pay attention to it. In this case, we know that the bonds have departed England on the 23rd because that's when they're counted, that's when the Olympia leaves, and it's made explicit. The thing which is not explicit is that we don't know for certain that they left on the Olympia.
Right. It's kind of like, I think that it's the lesson to be learned here, which is a good one for, reading Christie in general, is that when she's presenting a series of facts like this around a certain date, she's presenting the facts so that they appear a certain way. And what she's usually doing is somehow allowing for a contortion so that things are not actually as they appear. That's why we go through this snapshot of the way things appear to be, and then, we figure out the way that things actually are. So in that, she goes to great pains to make it very clear that on the 23rd, the boat left the harbor. On the 23rd, the bonds were put into the portmanteau at the bank. On the 23rd, Mr. Ridgway got onto the boat, that does not necessarily mean that all those three elements converged together.
Right.
That is the assumption that we make, and we make those sorts of assumptions every day, but those are exactly the sorts of logical assumptions that we shouldn't be making when we're trying to figure out the solution to a mystery in a Christie story.
Right. So that's one of the bigger structural clues, I think, within this. So let's quickly go through the clue clues.
The more traditional clues. Yeah.
Right. Mr. Shaw, even though we're never told of any threat of any kind, he's the one who's insisted that the portmanteau be fitted with special locks from Hubs, and that there are only three. He insists that he, Mr. Vavasour, and Ridgway are the only people who are allowed to even touch the keys. Even when he's out sick, no junior clerk or whatnot is allowed to have access to the keys. So our deduction here is if there are only three keys and one of the keys had to have been required for the theft to occur, then only a few things could have happened. Either one of them had to have been misplaced, one of them had to have been stolen, or one of them had to be used by one of the three people in possession of it. And conveniently for us, only one of the three bankers was the one who insisted on the special locks in the first place.
And we know that none of the keys had been misplaced or stolen.
Because they're all accounted for.
Because they're all accounted for. So that does put some suspicion on Mr. Shaw as the person who insisted on creating this scenario in which there were only three people that could possibly open up that box. Another clue, Mr. Shaw, again, has this severe case of bronchitis that takes him away from the office at exactly the time when the Bonds supposedly depart on the Olympia, and he then recovers after the ship returns. The timing of his bronchitis is somewhat suspect in that it is so convenient.
Right.
That's all.
And also because he's so concerned about the safety of the passage of these bonds, and then he's not even doing work when they're being shipped.
Right. Right. It's like his sickness was so severe that it knocked him out at exactly for the period of time when it would have made perfect sense for him to actually be keeping tabs on all of this and be very much visible. And then right when it was over is when he popped back up and became visible again. That's mighty convenient.
Right. And so then I think the last big clue is directly related to the first clue, and it's this bit of hearsay that one of the American brokers swears that he made a deal for the bonds, before even people had disembarked from the Olympia, and written off by Ridgway as sort of, and the bank as sort of, just an exaggerated rumor, an exaggeration.
People getting excited by
how quickly it had happened. But by writing it off, you think it's an exaggeration, but the reality is, what if it is not an exaggeration? What if, in fact, the bonds actually did come up for sale before the boat was searched, before the gangway was put down, and before people disembarked? That means that there are only several ways in which the bonds were sent. So either via wireless, which we are told is not possible. That's not a possible way to sell a bond. Via physical transfer to another vessel, which there was only one vessel that approached the ship, and it didn't leave the ship until it was escorted to harbor, so it couldn't have done it. Right. And so if we've discounted the two obvious possibilities, that they were still on the ship after the ship had been searched, but in that case, they couldn't have been sold before the ship landed. Right. So the only other option that it could possibly be would be that the bonds were never on the ship.
At all.
This
is a more traditional assumption that turns out to be false in, solving a Christie mystery. And this is one that I picked up on. I'm guessing that you picked up on it too, Catherine, when it was first laid in there of, some people say that they actually bought these bonds before the ship docked. When I read that, I knew immediately that was a clue, and that it was really important, and that it probably wasn't an exaggeration. So I was smart enough and astute enough not to make the assumption that Christie wants you to make. I feel like that was a fair kind of a clue. And of course, it turns out to be true that the bonds were not on the ship at all. And this goes back to that first kind of overriding clue. The ultimate solution is that they were on another ship, and they were on a ship that was traveling simultaneous with the Olympia, but a little bit faster than the Olympia. And
in
this
fact,
is the
an entire
gigantic.
day faster.
Right. This is the gigantic. This ship, we're told, only at the end of the story and not at the beginning of the story, was a whole day faster and but left the same day.
So ultimately what the solution is, right, and the solution is here is that super shady Mr. Shaw swapped out the bonds for a fake package, and then he himself hightailed it to Southampton. He transferred the real bonds over. He himself then boarded the Olympia under disguise as an invalid. He is, in fact, the invalid who has the adjacent room to Mr. Ridgway. And then he fakes, he did break in to the portmanteau so that he could remove the package, which is filled with, like, garbage.
And the fake package.
Correct. And dump it overboard before Ridgway can get to New York, open it up, and find out that he's, in fact, carrying, like, a box of crap.
Dummy package.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so basically the thing is the theft actually happened in the offices of the London and Scottish Bank in London before anything involving ocean liners happened.
Exactly. The crucial moment was when Shaw took the real bonds from that portmanteau and he put them into presumably just some other container, put that container onto the gigantic. It made its way over to the gigantic, and then whatever partner in crime he had over there picked it up and began selling it, which is why there were reports of the bonds being sold before
somebody got
docked.
They jumped the gun on selling it before the Olympia.
They jumped the gun. But my quibble, or I should say our quibble, I think we both had the same issue, is that I think it would be more fair if we were given the information that other ship was sailing at exactly the same time and had gotten into dock a day earlier at the beginning of the story rather than at the end when Poirot was telling us the solution, because it kind of violates the rule of give the reader all the information and then allow the reader to try to come up with
it completely violates it, because there's no I mean, you can know that, well, I guess the bonds couldn't have been on the boat, but then what's your alternative? Because if you don't know, if the reader doesn't know, and poor Captain Hastings obviously also doesn't know.
Yeah.
If you don't know that, you might know.
I suppose you could know that there were lots of transatlantic journeys being taken by various ships, especially in 1923. There were all sorts of ships going, crossing the Atlantic several times a day.
Well, but there's, what else is incredibly misleading about this is at the beginning of the story, they're reading about the Olympia. Poirot waxes very poetic about how how it must be very glamorous to ride on one of these luxury liners, except, he has mal de mer, so he's, never going to go on one. But it's basically implied from the very beginning page of the story that the Olympia is kind of the grandest vessel on the sea. And so to even think that there'd be something better or faster is never implied.
And it would be an opportune moment for Poirot or Hastings to just throw in a line of like, the only one that could even possibly come close to it is the gigantic.
Yeah, right. It would be all it would have had to have done would be a line like that, but we never get that. We never get the sensors in our ship, and so.
Yeah.
Poirot reveals this on essentially like the last page, that this is like how the con has happened, and it's information that is not provided. So, it's really, you can solve essentially the bare bones of what I suppose has happened, but it would be very, very hard to guess the how. The only possible solution is we were talking about the timing situation and when dates and times are really fixated on, especially when they involve from here to there scenario.
Right.
Where we've seen it in other stories. We've seen the sort of like hopping off the local, committing a crime, and then hopping back on the express so that you can essentially arrive at the same place. At the same time.
At the time, as if you had never gotten off the train. Yeah.
Correct. And so that's exactly what's happening here. So, a Christie reader would have seen this before. But, I mean, you do have to make that leap, and think,
that was in Hunter's Lodge, right? That was in the Mystery of Hunter's Lodge. And normally Christie is really good at providing all of that information, and she deftly drops it in there. And if you read carefully, or even if you do read carefully, sometimes when you go back, you're like, oh, right, okay, fair enough, Dame Agatha, you put one over on me. But this is one of the rare instances where
it's not there.
It's not there.
No, and then especially the irksome thing about this story is it's not just that, because part of it, it's actually a pretty elegant solution to it, that there's a faster ship. Outside of the fact that it's not
a faster ship.
Yeah. Outside of that, the other irksome thing about this is that Poirot does this before. Poirot essentially says that, after he meets with the bankers, that, oh God, I'm just so irritated. This was so much easier a mystery than I possibly imagined. But, I was hoping for more of a challenge. And that has happened in other stories. It happens in other books. But usually what it is, it's a signal to the reader on Christie's part that you've been given all of the information. Because
Absolutely.
It's supposed to be a clear signal, because it's both to Hastings and to the reader. And in this case, it's not, right? I mean... Yeah. We're not given all the information.
It'll be about one clue. I specifically remember in Styles, way before he tells us the solution, he zeroes in on the clue of the fire that's being lit on the hot day in July. And he's like, Hastings, do you really not see why that's an important clue? But he doesn't say how or why it is. But she's putting a spotlight on it. He's putting a spotlight on it. And it's at least, and at that point we were given the information that it was July. But here it's complete crap because we don't even have the information.
Well, and the funniest part is, I think Hastings speaks for us all when he says, good Lord Poirot, do you know I'd give a considerable sum of money to see you make a thorough ass of yourself, just for once. You're so confoundedly conceited. And Poirot responds with, do not enrage yourself, Hastings. In verity, I observe that there are times when you almost detest me. Alas, I suffer the penalties of greatness.
And then Hastings makes it better because he then says, the little man puffed out his chest and sighed so comically that I was forced to laugh. So it ends in a nice moment, at least. At
least Hastings can have a good sense of humor about the fact that he has to continue through the rest of the story, is still having no clue what's going on.
And it is interesting that the story ends, again, a bit of an abrupt ending to this short story, as there has been to all these short stories. Poirot essentially writes down the answer
in a sealed envelope.
In a sealed envelope, and gives it to the Scotland Yard inspector, not Inspector Japp, but Inspector McNeil, I believe.
Correct.
And then they go off to lunch with Esme, and he's looking forward to telling her that her fiance is off the hook and making her happy, I suppose. But we don't actually see that. That's it. We get a cheek kiss.
Right.
we get a cheek kiss. But it's like a fade. It's like a fade out as they begin their lunch, which is not a normal ending to one of these.
Not so much, because we also don't even know if they have proper evidence that's going to actually find the bonds or put Mr. Shaw away or anything else.
Right.
There's sort of basically just kind of circumstantial evidence in this.
Yeah, well, and we talked about this before, so I'll just mention it briefly, but this continues the pattern for me that I'm only noticing now upon rereading, that especially in the short stories, she's really loose with the reckonings of these. The reckonings are of very different quality from the formula that we see in the adaptations of these stories and that we see in the novels, where there's usually much more of okay, this is the person who did it and this is how it's proven, and we see them getting their comeuppance, however that may be. She's just sort of not as interested in putting a bow on the scenarios in these short stories because they're a little bit loose, and I like it.
In some ways it's almost more appealing than gathering everybody in a great room and like,
absolutely,
explaining out the case. And there's like a slight degree of almost nihilism to some of it. Like, well, nothing we can do here. I mean, I guess just like, hopefully they'll die in a plane. Hopefully they'll die in a plane crash.
If you had asked me before we started doing this podcast how formulaic she was, my sense of it was that she was a much more formulaic writer than I'm realizing now that we're actually reading these novels, and especially the short stories. Well, there's more variety to them.
The short stories are a little bit more experimental than you might think, especially given they're pretty short.
Totally.
And and especially the endings really take on a sort of they color the stories in a slightly unexpected way, I think.
We eventually will get through this Poirot collection of short stories, and when we do other short stories, it's not always going to be Poirot, and I believe the next collection is Tommy and Tuppence short stories, and those are super experimental too, because she's doing pastiches of other mystery writers for each story. So she's really just like having fun and playing with different things as a writer in these short stories, which I think is just, it makes her a more interesting writer overall. So
we should talk about the adaptation.
Let's talk about the adaptation. Yeah. So this is an early Poirot, as most of these short story adaptations are. I believe it's episode 3 in the third series/season, and like many of these adaptations, particularly the last one we talked about, which was The Mystery of Hunter's Lodge, since again in the short story we have the pattern of someone coming to Poirot after the crime has happened, asking him to consult on the case, that is not a very dynamic way to present your story. It works fine in like a 12-page short story. They have to go through these convolutions because they want to actually just have them there as the action is happening. And here they just basically have the bank acting out of an abundance of cautiousness, saying, we want to bring Monsieur Poirot on to consult to make sure that this whole business of transferring the Liberty Bond is as safe as it is. And they even have this character that doesn't exist in the short story, who is the head of security at the bank, the sort of internal security department. He's very annoyed that they're bringing in Poirot when there hasn't even been a problem yet. So they kind of highlight that. You could argue it's a weakness, but it's fine. It works. Like they make it work in this case. As a reason for why Poirot is there when everything goes awry. And then, of course, what they have happen is that Poirot and Hastings go on the actual transatlantic journey. So this is very much a Poirot and Hastings on a boat adventure. And I have a lot of fun with it.
And Hastings is so psyched about that boat ride.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so the really big change that they do here, in keeping with the different time in which the episodes are set, since it is in the mid-30s, instead of being on the Olympia, they are going on a real boat, which is the Queen Mary. And this is one of the rare episodes where we actually can tell you the exact date in which most of the episode takes place, because they are very specific about going on the Queen Mary's maiden voyage, which was May 27th, 1936. And that's in keeping with, all of these episodes taking place around 1934, 35, 36, or in the years leading up to World War II. It's quite a grand transatlantic crossing that they go on. I mean, it's a little bit, I'm sorry, I couldn't help thinking of Titanic. As I was watching this, I'm going to admit that I was imagining Poirot and Hastings on the bow of the ship, arms open to the breeze, a little bit of a Jack and Rose kind of romance.
All right, open your eyes.
It can be totally platonic, but I feel like Poirot and Hastings they're having their shipboard adventure here. I was into it.
They're doing like the Irish jig down in like the steerage class.
There's no real like Billy Zane character, unfortunately. It would actually be really funny though if there was someone who was like trying to keep Poirot and Hastings apart, and it's like they have this like raucous night, and then he's like, "You will not speak to him again, Arthur."
Oh, tragedy. You can both fit on that door. You can both fit on the door.
God, which one would sacrifice like for the other's life? I mean, let's be honest. I feel like it would be Hastings in the icy water. Poirot needs to conserve those little gray cells.
No, he'd be too cold and he'd be too meticulous and he wouldn't want to get his suit wet. He would not particularly care, perhaps, if, he'd feel slightly bad about it, I think, but he's not getting off of that, floating piece of wood. No way.
He'd be the only one who would manage in the entire shipwreck episode to
be perfectly dry.
Wet.
Yeah, he'd be perfectly dry. Yeah.
Not only does he not have hypothermia, he's like perfectly dry, just completely warm in like a little smoking jacket with like tisane of tea or like some melted chocolate.
I'm sure he has something in his many, many cases that he's brought with just, in the event. Because what we see, one of the best things about the adaptation is Poirot's packing for it.
Oh my God. Yeah. So Miss Lemon is in this episode, although she is criminally underused. But yes, there's this great scene when she's helping him pack and she basically yells at him and says, you can't bring every outfit on this trip. And he basically just has like all of these little waistcoats that he wants to bring, and
everything has to like match the
I put in your blue tie and the mauve silk waistcoat.
And I shall take also the brown suit and the 2 waistcoats that coordinate.
You can't take your entire wardrobe, Mr. Poirot.
And also, we see a thing of his table, and he must have, 10 different serums and, different sort of,
Oh, yeah. We need to talk about this. So, basically, we mentioned in the story that there's a slight mention of mal de mer, seasickness that Poirot makes, which is his reason for why he's not interested in, doing any of these transatlantic crossings. So they really run with this in the episode, and it becomes an ongoing joke that Poirot is not super excited about going on the Queen Mary because he's worried he's going to get seasickness again, as he did when he came to England the first time as a Belgian refugee during World War I. So they have this pan to all of his pills and potions and tonics and whatnot that he's bringing with him, and there are a lot of them, and I've just got to mention that one of them is prominently labeled diarrhea bowel mixture.
Oh, there's a close-up of it.
It's like they really want us to, there's a close-up of it, and then later on, while they're on the boat too, there's a pan across it. So just in case the first time we missed the diarrhea bowel mixture, they really want us to know. He also, and right next to it, there is a bottle of Seidlitz powder, which is definitely a laxative. So,
I hope that you looked that up and you don't actually have some arcane knowledge of 1930s.
No, I did. Where I was prepared for getting very seasick. And Hastings is rather contemptuous of this. Of course, what happens is that Poirot isn't seasick at all, and Hastings has horrible seasickness, but he won't admit it. And the entire time he claims that he's suffering from food poisoning. So there's a bit of hijinks.
Bonjour, Hastings. Comment ça va?
No, I'm terrible. I tell you, Poirot, it's not seasickness. I'm never seasick. Must have been that oyster last night.
If you wish, I have some pills.
Thank you, Poirot. I'll be perfectly all right.
Yeah, all of the hijinks on board the ship are actually pretty good, especially because even the changes in the adaptation don't necessarily make the adaptation's mystery particularly more compelling. Mm-hmm. Mr. Shaw, part of the reason they're brought on to the case at the to begin with is that Mr. Shaw, who's supposed to be the carrier of the bonds, he's almost run over at the beginning.
I thought that was a good change that they, it's rather static and boring that the only way that Mr. Shaw absents himself from the action is by claiming that he has bronchitis. In the adaptation, his partner is this woman that he apparently is in love with, and they're planning on getting married, and she pretends to run him over at the beginning of the episode, and he claims that it's fine and he wants to continue on with everything, and we don't really have any idea that he's in on it yet. And then he's drinking coffee in his office, and then we get this odd slow motion breaking of the coffee cup, which didn't really seem to be in keeping with the tone of the show. But anyway, he says that he's been poisoned, and the claim, he falls ill, and he gets a nurse. And this nurse is actually his partner in crime, and she ends up going on the ship and pretending to be this rather saucy, sexy Southern belle named Randa Brooks, who is next door to Captain Hastings, who Captain Hastings is very smitten with. What a surprise.
The disguises thing.
Yeah. In the last short story that we talked about, the disguise was in the short story, and then they kept it in the adaptation in the Suchet series, which, okay, fair enough. It was central to the mystery. Here, they're adding that as an element.
No, there's a disguise in the short story too. The disguise just happens to be Mr. Shaw's.
Yeah, but the disguise is just he hides himself away. I mean, I guess maybe he puts glasses on and pretends to be older, but like that's a far cry from having this woman dress up both as a nurse, and they go really far with that, where she's very dowdy and her teeth are sticking out and she looks odd, and then they have her dress up. They make the disguise about like 10 times more of an element of the story.
No, it's true.
Than it is in the...
It's true. I wish we should be keeping a running tally of mysteries in which part of the plot hinges on a costume, because so far, I mean, it's certainly the mysterious Fred Styles, the man in the brown suit,
Mystery of Hunter's Lodge,
the $1 million Mystery of Hunter's Lodge, $1 million bond robbery. Is the adventure of the cheap flat. There is like some confusion over identity and costuming, certainly.
Sure.
Let us not ever forget in Western Star the Asian makeup.
I don't know. For me, it's never Christie's most impressive.
No, it's funny. It's funny how many, if you don't really notice it on their own, particularly. Right. But when you start actually adding up how many times you run across that, it becomes a little bit curious.
Yeah, just because we know how rarely effective it would be in real life. I mean, it's another suspension of disbelief. I mean, how many people successfully dress up as someone else and thereby pull off a crime or a murder? Just not many.
I feel like that does not happen with great frequency.
And they do layer in another clue in the adaptation, in that Poirot senses something is amiss with Miranda Brooks, the sultry Southern belle on the boat, and he asks her for the time. And she makes this really weird gesture as she's flipping her wrist over to look at her watch. And I'm actually really annoyed with myself that I didn't figure out this clue and deduce properly, because I really did pick up on how weird her gesture was. And basically what was happening is that at first she was going to grab the little watch hanging from her nurse's uniform, because she was used to dressing up as Mr. Shaw's nurse right before she got on the boat. So it's like she goes to grab for that, and then she twists her wrist around, and that's how Poirot puts it together that the nurse and Miranda Brooks are one and the same. So that's a little added clue in the adaptation, which I guess was clever, but I don't know. I wasn't super happy with that.
No, that was... Yeah, the only other big difference in adapting it was that Ridgway in the adaptation is kind of a lout, whereas he's like a super, super upright citizen in the short story.
Yeah.
And so, in the short story, he's so nervous and, sad about what's happened, and his fiancée seems like a lovely girl who really has faith in him, and there's kind of really not the expectation that he's actually guilty in the short story. Whereas, it is set up in the episode that, something shady is going on with him.
Right, and they do actually, and there is one other clue that they work in here, and this one I quite liked, and I thought it was quite in keeping with Christie, because the fiancée keeps on asking Monsieur Poirot to watch her fiancé. She says, you must watch him. And she says it a couple of times before they go on the Queen Mary. And what we ultimately realize is that she's worried that he is actually going to either steal the Liberty Bonds himself or just do something bad. She's not saying watch him so that you can protect him from other people. She's saying watch him so that you can protect him from himself. And that's the sort of twisting of the regular meaning of words that Christie does very well. This isn't perhaps the best example of it, but I appreciated it, and it was in keeping with with these Christie mysteries, and it does make the whole thing more interesting overall that he seems like more of an actual suspect
Right.
than he did in the story. Although I will say that the big it kind of points out a really big flaw in Mr. Shaw's plot, which is if at any point on the transatlantic crossing Mr. Ridgway just used his key to open up the box and check that the Liberty bonds were okay, he would have seen that they were dummy bonds and not the actual bonds, right?
Well, they're theoretically wrapped, right? I mean, he would actually have to open the package up, correct?
I guess. I mean, in the adaptation, he's such a loser lout kind of a person that we know he's never really going to check on them. It's more like, is he going to open it up and actually use the Liberty bonds to play more poker?
Right.
Because he's out so much money already, but... I guess that's true. It's just, I mean, there is someone else on the boat that actually has access to these dummy bonds that, like, could potentially figure it out.
Mr. Shaw's plan in general is not very good.
And actually, though, in that he had an accomplice working with him in the adaptation, I mean, she took his key when she went on the boat and then gave him his key when she came back. So why did he have to be out of commission if his accomplice was the one on the boat?
Good question. Because he was in the short story?
Right. I mean, it's like in the short story, he did because he didn't have an accomplice. So obviously he had to be out of commission because he wasn't there. But here, I guess at the point at which they found out that the bonds had been stolen, the ship still had to come back and she still had the key. So he would have not had the key then. But I feel like that might be a flaw.
Yeah. The only thing that it could possibly be argued would be that if suspicion fell on him in some way, because he does have an alibi then in the adaptation that he does not have in the short story, because he's actually in England and in bed in the adaptation.
Right.
Whereas
but he could have just been at work in England.
This is true.
Right?
This is true. Touche.
And plus, also, if anyone was going to ask him for the key, I mean, yeah, I think that's a flaw, because even if anyone was going to ask him for the key early, they could have asked him for the key early while he was sick, supposedly recovering from being poisoned. That doesn't help matters in terms of the asking for the key issue, the key that he didn't have because his accomplice still had it and was coming back on the boat. That's not helpful.
Definitely the case. Yeah, you might be right. This might just be like a flaw here.
Interesting. Even so, all of the boat business and the fun with the Queen Mary, which, by the way, fun fact, is docked not very far from us in Long Beach, California, and has been for like the last 40 years. I don't know. Have you ever gone to the Queen Mary?
I've never been. I almost went. They do a haunted Halloween thing there because supposedly, if one believes in spookiness and ghosts, the Queen Mary is quite haunted.
Right.
But no, I've never ventured to it. I think that there's like holiday celebrations too for the winter season.
They have lots of holiday things. I think there might be like an ice skating rink and some sort of ice capades-ish winter wonderland thing there right now. And I know that it's also the scene of a lot of stand-up comedy.
Oh, the thing that I love.
Some have been more unfortunate than others, yes.
Gee, if I had been intending to go to the Queen Mary, I think you might have turned me from doing so. But, maybe it'd be fun for Halloween or for, Although ice skating on a ship sounds a little bit questionable, too.
The whole idea of visiting a ship that's docked, I guess other than for the interest of the ship itself, I'm not really sure what the draw is, but...
You know what the draw is? You get to be on a luxury liner. You get to be on a cruise ship without possibly risking a terrible case of, rotavirus.
But you're on a ship that's not moving. What's the point?
You're also not on a ship where you're going to get hundreds of people throwing up in the hallways, and
I guess you can leave your diarrhea bowel mixture at home.
Save that for your next princess cruise.
All right. Well, I think we're done. Join us if you dare next week for a special Christmas-themed Christie short story, The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding. And that is another Hercule Poirot. In the meantime, please contact us via email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. You could also rate and review us on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you listen to this podcast. We would love to hear from you in that forum. You can follow us on Twitter at allaboutthedame, and you can also follow us on Instagram at allaboutthedame. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.